The drawing room at Thornfield Manor, separated from the entrance hall by a set of heavy oak doors, became the reluctant headquarters for what would soon be recognized as one of the most curious cases in the recent history of Ashford St. Mary. The guests, initially bewildered and uncertain how to conduct themselves in the presence of sudden death, were politely but firmly ushered into this space by Lady Thornfield, who possessed that particular quality of authority that made disagreement seem almost impossible. Within 20 minutes, Constable Morrison had arrived from the village, a competent if uninspired man in his early 50s, who had spent the greater part of his career dealing with minor infractions, stolen bicycles, disputed property boundaries, and the occasional drunken disturbance at the Red Lion public house. He stood now in the center of the room, his uniform somehow appearing slightly too small for his frame, his expression one of barely concealed bewilderment as he surveyed the assembled company, with the expression of a man confronted with a puzzle whose pieces refused to fit together in any sensible manner. The body of Edward Ashford remained upstairs in the Blue Room, which had been sealed by Dr. Pemberton's instructions, pending the arrival of the proper authorities from the county town. Dr. Pemberton himself stood near the fireplace, speaking in low tones with Lady Thornfield, occasionally glancing toward the gathered guests with the expression of someone who had ventured quite beyond the scope of his ordinary professional experience. What had transpired in that locked room on the second floor was, by all accounts, extraordinarily straightforward, and yet profoundly mysterious. Edward Ashford had retired to the Blue Room at approximately 2 o'clock, expressing a desire for a brief rest after the journey from London. The maid who had discovered him, a nervous girl named Susan, who had been tasked with turning down the beds for any guests who might require them, had entered the room at 3 o'clock to deliver fresh towels. She had found Mr. Ashford lying on the floor beside the window, a deep wound visible at the base of his skull, and the window itself standing wide open despite the considerable height from which one might fall. Miss Marple, seated in a corner of the drawing-room upon a velvet settee, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on what appeared to be a simple cream-colored cardigan, found herself in the peculiar position of being almost entirely overlooked by those around her. Constable Morrison had made a vague gesture in her direction, as though remembering some half-formed notion about the importance of interviewing witnesses, but had then become distracted by the rather more pressing matter of determining whether the room had indeed been locked from the inside, as Mr. Thorne had insisted when he and the vicar had forced entry moments after Lady Thornfield's discovery. The constable's uncertainty on this point seemed to agitate him considerably, and he had questioned both men several times, receiving the same answer each instance. Yes, the key had been in the lock on the inside, and no, neither man had disturbed it before turning the mechanism. The implications of this fact, should it prove accurate, were not lost on anyone present, least of all upon Miss Marple, who continued her knitting with undiminished concentration while her mind worked with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. The reactions of the various guests to this dreadful news had been, as Miss Marple observed them, quite extraordinarily revealing in their individual character. The vicar, naturally, had been shocked and grieved, though there was something in his expression that suggested a complexity of emotion beyond simple sorrow. His sister, Mrs. Ashford, had wept openly, though her tears seemed directed more toward the disruption of propriety than toward any genuine affection for her brother-in-law, whom Miss Marple recalled hearing mentioned in various village conversations she had never particularly cared for. Thomas Hartley, the doctor's nephew, had gone very still, his usual nervous energy seeming to drain from him entirely, and he had found it necessary to sit down quite suddenly. Most intriguingly of all, Lord Brackenstall had excused himself from the room within minutes of the announcement, citing a sudden indisposition, and had not returned despite the considerable awkwardness of his absence. Miss Catherine Wells, the art instructor, had fixed her gaze upon a painting of hunting dogs above the mantelpiece, and had not moved it for the better part of 10 minutes. Her expression one of such profound shock that it suggested to Miss Marple's experienced eye that this development was entirely unexpected and profoundly distressing to her in ways that mere politeness could not account for. The question of how Edward Ashford had come to be in the locked room with a fatal wound to his skull remained, quite literally, locked within the confines of the Blue Room upstairs. Dr. Pemberton, when finally drawn into conversation by Constable Morrison, had suggested that while death appeared to have resulted from blunt force trauma, he could not, without proper examination, and perhaps the involvement of medical authorities from the city, determine precisely when death had occurred, or the exact nature of the instrument that had caused the injury. The open window presented its own puzzle. A fall from that height would have been quite sufficient to cause death, and yet there were no signs that the body had been dragged or moved after impact. The carpet beneath W. Here, Edward Ashford lay bore no significant traces of blood, suggesting that he had died where he fell, inside the room, and yet the window remained open to the afternoon air, a detail that seemed to defy logical explanation. By 4 o'clock, a more senior police inspector had been summoned from the county, and the village constable had been relegated to the considerably less comfortable task of ensuring that none of the assembled guests departed the manor without permission. The drawing-room had transformed into something resembling a peculiar sort of prison, comfortable and well-appointed perhaps, but a prison nonetheless. And Miss Marple continued her knitting with the serene expression of one who had nowhere in particular to be, and considerable time to observe the fascinating interplay of human nature that such circumstances inevitably produced. Inspector David Hartwell arrived at Thornfield Manor at 4:30, emerging from his motor car with the deliberate efficiency of a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades extracting order from chaos. He was tall and lean, with the sort of face that suggested a life spent in careful observation, though his eyes carried a certain weariness that spoke to countless cases, countless interviews, and countless moments when human nature had revealed itself to be far less noble than one might hope. He was accompanied by a younger sergeant named Williams, whose notebook already bore several preliminary jottings, and a police photographer, whose equipment cases clinked softly as he set about documenting the scene with methodical precision. The inspector had spent precisely 15 minutes in the blue room before descending to the drawing room with an expression that suggested he had encountered something that did not, in any obvious way, conform to the usual patterns of criminal behavior. He had requested that Lady Thornfield provide him with a private study where he might conduct interviews, and she had graciously offered the library, a handsome room lined with leather-bound volumes that seemed entirely at odds with the grim business that was about to transpire within its walls. It was at this point that Miss Marple's observations truly began in earnest, though to any casual observer she appeared to be doing nothing whatsoever except completing the second sleeve of her cardigan and occasionally glancing toward the windows where the golden afternoon light was beginning its inevitable transition toward early evening. She had, however, noted with great interest that when Inspector Hartwell's eyes swept across the assembled company during his initial assessment, they had lingered for perhaps a half-second longer upon Lord Brackenstall than upon any other individual present. This was a tiny thing, a momentary hesitation that might have been nothing at all, but Miss Marple had spent sufficient years observing the patterns of human recognition to understand that such moments rarely occurred without cause. The inspector began his interviews with methodical precision, summoning first Lady Thornfield, then Dr. Pemberton, and then a series of other guests in an order that seemed largely dictated by proximity and convenience rather than any particular suspicion. Miss Marple observed as each individual departed from the drawing-room toward the library, and, more carefully still, she observed the state in which each returned. The vicar, when he emerged, appeared considerably diminished, his usual ministerial composure shaken by what appeared to have been a rather searching interrogation. Mrs. Ashford, his sister, had returned with her eyes considerably reddened, though whether from tears or from the intense nature of her questioning was impossible to determine with certainty. Thomas Hartley had Emma. Jed with his hands trembling slightly, though this might have been attributable to the nervousness that seemed to be his natural state rather than to anything particular that had transpired during his interview. It was at approximately 6 o'clock, as the autumn light outside had begun to take on that peculiar quality of deepening blue that precedes true dusk, that Inspector Hartwell requested the presence of Lord Brackenstall. The aristocrat rose from his chair with a languid grace that suggested considerable indifference to the proceedings, though Miss Marple, still knitting steadily in her corner, observed that his hand, as it smoothed the fabric of his jacket, trembled with what appeared to be either anger or profound anxiety. He was absent from the drawing-room for nearly 20 minutes, considerably longer than any of the previous interviews, and when he finally returned, his face had acquired a peculiar pallor, and his jaw was clenched with such force that the muscles beneath the skin were quite visibly defined. Within moments of his return, Inspector Hartwell emerged and requested the presence of Miss Catherine Wells. The art instructor rose with considerably more composure than Lord Brackenstall had displayed, though there was something in the set of her shoulders that suggested she was marshalling her courage for an encounter she had been dreading. As she passed Miss Marple's chair, the elderly woman glanced up from her knitting with an expression of such gentle sympathy that Miss Catherine Wells nearly stumbled, and her eyes, when they met Miss Marple's for the briefest of moments, held the expression of someone standing upon the very edge of an abyss. The drawing-room fell into a peculiar sort of quiet after her departure, the sort of silence that seemed to press upon those gathered with an almost physical weight. The gaslight had been lit some 20 minutes earlier, casting warm pools of illumination around the room while leaving the corners in deep shadow. The other guests attempted to maintain a veneer of normal conversation, but the efforts were strained and unconvincing. The doctor and his wife spoke in low tones about a matter of absolute irrelevance. Two of the farmers discussed the prospects for the harvest with a sort of forced enthusiasm that suggested their minds were entirely elsewhere. The headmistress of the school sat in solitary contemplation, her hands folded in her lap, her expression distant. It was this quality of strained tension, Miss Marple understood, that was itself revealing. Most people, when confronted with a murder and the uncertainty of suspicion, would react with some degree of genuine fear for their own possible implication. Yet there was present in this room another emotion, one that she recognized from her many years of village observation, the guilty knowledge that one possessed information of consequence, information that one was perhaps concealing, information that might or might not be directly relevant to the death of Edward Ashford, but which nevertheless pressed upon the conscience with considerable weight. When Miss Catherine Wells finally emerged from the library nearly 30 minutes later, her face was absolutely colorless, and her eyes were quite fixed upon the ground before her. She sank into a chair with the movement of someone whose strength had been entirely depleted, and though she did not weep, there was something in her stillness that suggested an internal landscape of profound distress. Inspector Hartwell, following her back into the drawing-room, announced that interviews would resume the following morning, and that Lady Thornfield had graciously offered to accommodate those guests who wished to remain at the manor overnight. As darkness fell completely beyond the W. Indoors, Miss Marple continued her knitting, her needles clicking softly in the gaslit warmth, and within her extraordinarily well-ordered mind, certain patterns had begun to emerge with the clarity of a photograph slowly developing in chemical solution. The dining room at Thornfield Manor, with its long mahogany table and the portraits of Lady Thornfield's ancestors gazing down from the walls with expressions of aristocratic indifference, became the setting for a most peculiar dinner that evening. Lady Thornfield had made the decision, after consultation with Inspector Hartwell, that maintaining at least the appearance of normal routine would be preferable to allowing the assembled guests to dissolve into complete disarray. Accordingly, a somewhat subdued meal had been prepared, though the quality of the cuisine seemed almost obscene given the circumstances under which it was being consumed. Miss Marple found herself seated between the vicar and Thomas Hartley, a position that afforded her excellent opportunities for observation without appearing to participate in anything beyond the most casual of conversations. The vicar, she noted, consumed very little of the food presented to him, instead pushing items around his plate with his fork, in the manner of one whose appetite had been entirely supplanted by anxiety. Thomas Hartley, by contrast, ate with the desperate intensity of a man using food as a mechanism through which to avoid engaging in meaningful dialogue. Lord Brackenstall was noticeably absent from the table, having claimed indisposition and requesting that a tray be sent to his room, a choice that the other guests seemed to regard with barely concealed significance. It was Mr. Desmond Thorne, the estate manager, who provided the most revealing performance of the evening. He sat with his hands gripping the arms of his chair as though preparing for some physical assault, and his eyes kept returning again and again to the doorway through which Miss Catherine Wells entered, somewhat late to the meal, her appearance suggesting that she had been weeping but had taken considerable pains to restore her composure. When their eyes met, even briefly and accidentally, something seemed to pass between them, a question perhaps, or an acknowledgement of shared knowledge that neither had anticipated would become relevant to their circumstances. The conversation, such as it was, circled endlessly around the question of Edward Ashford's death, without ever quite addressing it directly. Mrs. Ashford spoke extensively about her late husband's brother as he had been in childhood, creating an almost mythological figure quite at variance with the middle-aged publishing executive who had been discovered in the locked room upstairs. The vicar made several rather fumbling attempts to redirect the conversation toward more elevated topics, as though the murder itself might somehow be more bearable if one simply refused to acknowledge its reality. The doctor and his wife maintained a professional neutrality that seemed almost offensive in its indifference to the tragedy that had befallen the gathering. It was during the second course, as Lady Thornfield's cook had rather optimistically prepared a roasted pheasant despite the circumstances, that Miss Marple made a particularly astute observation. Susan, the young maid who had discovered Edward Ashford's body, was serving the table, and her hands, Miss Marple noted, shook with such violence that she nearly dropped the serving platter onto the lap of one of the farmers. What was interesting about this trembling, however, was not its intensity. One would expect a young servant to be quite thoroughly traumatized by such an experience, but rather its selective nature. Susan's hands remained perfectly steady when serving most of the guests, but the moment she approached Lord Brackenstall's empty chair and was forced to place a plate there, according to Lady Thornfield's instructions, her trembling became almost violent enough to cause genuine concern. When Miss Marple casually inquired of the maid later, as the young woman was clearing the dessert course, whether she had perhaps known Mr. Ashford prior to his arrival at the manor, Susan's face had acquired such a sudden pallor that she had been forced to sit down quite abruptly upon a conveniently positioned footstool. I may have seen him before," she had whispered, her voice barely audible before fleeing the dining room with such haste that she had left several plates behind her. By the time the evening had progressed toward 9 o'clock, and the guests had scattered to various parts of the manor according to their dispositions, some toward the drawing-room for what passed for an attempt at normal social intercourse, others to their assigned bedrooms with the obvious intention of avoiding further conversation, Miss Marple had begun to construct a framework upon which subsequent observations might be arranged. She knew, from the pattern of Inspector Hartwell's inquiries, and from the remarkable transparency of human behavior under stress, that he was operating under the assumption that Lord Brackenstall was the primary suspect. This seemed to her a conclusion drawn from insufficient evidence, though she acknowledged that appearances could be quite deceiving. What she had observed, however, was a structure of relationships far more complex and laden with hidden emotional currents than any simple narrative of jealousy or impulsive violence could accommodate. There was the matter of Mr. Thorne's obvious attachment to Miss Catherine Wells, combined with the equally obvious recent history between Lord Brackenstall and that same young woman. There was the question of why Edward Ashford, a publishing executive from London with no apparent connection to the village, had chosen to accept an invitation to Lady Thornfield's autumn gathering. There was the peculiar anxiety that had manifested in the vicar's behavior, an anxiety that seemed to exceed what simple shock at a guest's death might reasonably produce. And there was the locked room itself, a puzzle that continued to gnaw at the orderly compartments of Miss Marple's mind with the persistence of an unfinished thought. She had retired to her bedroom at 9:30, a comfortable chamber decorated in shades of rose and cream, and had settled herself into the window seat with her knitting and her thoughts. From this vantage point, she had observed the village beyond the manor's grounds, its cottages lit by lamplight, its streets empty and quiet at this late hour. Somewhere in the darkness beyond, constables maintained their watch. Somewhere in the manor itself, a murderer rested, perhaps peacefully, or perhaps tormented by the knowledge of what they had done. And somewhere within Miss Marple's carefully organized mind, the pieces of this puzzle were beginning, ever so gradually, to align themselves into a pattern that made a dreadful sort of sense. The morning that followed brought with the particular quality of autumn daylight that seemed somehow indifferent to the tragedy that had so thoroughly disrupted the ordinary rhythms of village life. Inspector Hartwell had established himself quite formally in Lady Thornfield's library, and his second round of interviews began with considerable determination shortly after breakfast had been cleared away. Miss Marple, having taken her morning tea in her room and dressed with her customary care in a dress of pale blue wool, had ventured downstairs to find the manor in a state of carefully controlled tension. Constables were visible in the hallways, the blue room upstairs remained sealed with official police tape, and the photograph plates from the previous evening had been packed away by the police photographer with an air of finality that suggested he at least had concluded his business at Thornfield. What was most interesting, however, was the absence of Lord Brackenstall from the breakfast table. When Miss Marple casually inquired of Lady Thornfield regarding his well-being, she received the response that his lordship had informed the servants of his intention to depart immediately after the conclusion of his interview with Inspector Hartwell, circumstances permitting. This announcement had produced a reaction of such profound anxiety in the inspector that he had, within moments, stationed a constable at the front entrance with instructions that no one was to depart the manor without explicit authorization. By mid-morning, the situation had evolved into something approaching a minor crisis, with Lord Brackenstall insisting with increasing vehemence that he had no obligation to remain, that his presence was entirely coincidental to the matter at hand, and that any suggestion of his involvement in Edward Ashford's death was not merely offensive but absurd. Inspector Hartwell had maintained his composure with admirable restraint, though it was evident that the aristocrat's resistance was causing him considerable professional difficulty. It was at this juncture that a constable arrived with a telegram that seemed to alter the entire complexion of the investigation. The message, from London, concerned itself with Edward Ashford's professional history and contained information that appeared to strike Inspector Hartwell with considerable force. He emerged from the library shortly thereafter with an expression suggesting that his understanding of the case had undergone a fundamental transformation. Within the hour, he had requested the presence of the vicar, the doctor, and Mr. Desmond Thorne in his interview room, conducting what appeared to be a significantly more intensive examination of each man than the previous day's preliminary questioning. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had positioned herself in the morning room with her knitting, positioned in such a manner that she possessed an unobstructed view of the hallway leading toward the library. This positioning, while appearing entirely innocent and coincidental, had been quite deliberately chosen. It was from this vantage point that she observed Thomas Hartley emerging from the library with the expression of someone who had just received an extraordinary shock, followed by what appeared to be an urgent conversation between the young man and Lord Brackenstall in the corridor beyond. The exchange was conducted in urgent whispers, but Miss Marple's ears, though they had not the acuity they had possessed in her youth, were quite sufficient to discern fragments of considerable significance. Lord Brackenstall had apparently known Edward Ashford in London, a fact that he had neglected to mention during his interview. Moreover, the two men had apparently been engaged in some sort of dispute concerning a matter that Lord Brackenstall refused, even now, to specify. By early afternoon, it became apparent that Inspector Hartwell was preparing to make what he clearly believed would be an arrest. He had summoned the entire household into the drawing-room, a theatrical gesture that Miss Marple recognized as either the mark of genuine conviction or the desperate resort of an investigator who had become confused by the multiplicity of possible explanations before him. She positioned herself in her customary corner, her knitting needles moving with mechanical precision, and waited with the patience that comes from a lifetime of observation. The inspector's statement, when it came, focused upon Lord Brackenstall with an intensity that seemed to leave no room for doubt. He outlined a history of dispute between the aristocrat and Edward Ashford, a matter concerning inheritance and legitimacy that reached back some 30 years. He described how Lord Brackenstall's presence at Thornfield had been no coincidence, but rather a deliberate effort to confront Ashford about matters that threatened his financial stability and social position. He described how the locked room might have been secured from the inside by someone possessed of knowledge of the manor's construction, someone who had previously taken pains to familiarize themselves with the geography of the house. And he described the open window as a deliberate deception, designed to suggest suicide or accidental death rather than murder. When he concluded by announcing his intention to place Lord Brackenstall under arrest pending the formal charges that would follow, a visible wave of something that might have been relief seemed to wash across the assembled company. Yet Miss Marple continued her knitting without pause, her needles clicking softly in a rhythm that seemed almost disconnected from the drama unfolding around her. And when Lord Brackenstall turned, as he was being led away by the constables, to meet her eyes with an expression of desperate appeal, she observed something in that glance that suggested, to her analytical mind, a profound misunderstanding at the very heart of the inspector's conclusions. She set down her knitting needles with deliberate care, and rose from her chair with the steady determination of someone who has arrived at a point where silence would constitute something approaching a moral betrayal of the principles that had guided her through a lifetime of careful observation. "Inspector Hartway." "LL." Miss Marple's voice, when she finally broke her silence, possessed that particular quality of gentle firmness that seemed to arrest the attention of everyone within the drawing-room with remarkable effectiveness. The inspector, who had been in the process of departing with his constables and his prisoner, turned with an expression that suggested he was not accustomed to being interrupted by elderly women during the conclusion of his investigations. "I wonder if you might spare a moment for the observations of someone who has spent rather more time in this household than perhaps your official inquiries have allowed." The inspector's expression shifted from irritation to something approaching reluctant curiosity, and he made a gesture that indicated Miss Marple should proceed, though his posture suggested he expected to hear nothing of particular relevance. "The matter of the locked room," Miss Marple continued, resuming her seat with the unhurried grace of someone entirely unaffected by the skepticism directed toward her, "presents certain difficulties that I fear may not have been entirely considered. The key, you understand, was found in the lock on the interior of the door. This fact would indeed suggest that someone within the room secured themselves there deliberately, or that someone departed the room and then somehow secured the door from the outside. A matter of considerable technical difficulty without the assistance of tools or implements that I have seen no evidence of being employed." Inspector Hartwell's expression suggested that he had already considered this matter, but Miss Marple continued with undiminished placidity. "However, there exists a third possibility that might merit consideration. What if the room were not locked at the moment of the murder itself, but rather locked subsequently? The blue room, if I am not mistaken, connects to the adjoy Ning guest chamber through a door that is concealed by the heavy tapestry that hangs upon the eastern wall. If someone had access to both chambers, the securing of the room from the interior, following the departure of the killer through that concealed passage, would present no particular difficulty whatsoever." This statement produced a visible reaction in Inspector Hartwell, who exchanged a glance with Sergeant Williams that suggested the possibility had not, indeed, been thoroughly explored. "Furthermore," Miss Marple continued, her knitting needles momentarily pausing in their endless rhythm, "I feel compelled to observe that Lord Brackenstall, whatever his history with the deceased Mr. Ashford might have been, possesses neither the knowledge of this house's peculiarities nor the access to the adjoining chamber that would be required to execute such a deception. However, the estate manager, Mr. Desmond Thorne, would possess both such knowledge and such access, having worked within these walls for some 5 years and being intimately acquainted with every architectural detail of the manor." The drawing-room had fallen into a profound silence, broken only by the sudden and visible movement of Mr. Thorne, who had begun to rise from his chair as though preparing to flee. 2 constables, at a sharp gesture from Inspector Hartwell, moved to intercept him, their movements swift and efficient. "I would not, however," Miss Marple added, her voice never wavering in its gentle cadence, "be entirely convinced that Mr. Thorne acted alone in this matter, or indeed that murder as it was committed, sprang from the motives that Inspector Hartwell has attributed to Lord Brackenstall. The matter is considerably more complex, I believe, than a simple question of inheritance or social position." She paused, allowing her eyes to rest momentarily upon Miss Catherine Wells, who had gone, quite pale, and whose hands had begun to tremble with visible violence. "Consider, if you will, the curious fact that Mr. Edward Ashford arrived at this gathering by invitation, yet no one seems entirely certain precisely who extended that invitation nor upon what basis it was accepted. Consider further that young Thomas Hartley, the doctor's nephew, appeared to possess considerable familiarity with Mr. Ashford's presence at the manor prior to the unfortunate discovery, despite having claimed ignorance when interviewed regarding his own relationship with the deceased. Thomas Hartley had risen abruptly, his face flushed with a combination of anger and something approaching desperate panic. Consider also," Miss Marple continued with inexorable calm, "that Susan, the young housemaid, displayed a degree of emotional disturbance upon serving the table that far exceeded what mere shock at a murder would ordinarily produce. A young woman's trembling hands, Inspector, suggest not trauma at discovering a stranger's death, but rather profound personal distress, at the presence of individuals who have caused her considerable pain. What emerged gradually, over the course of the next several hours, as Inspector Hartwell was forced to pursue these threads with considerably greater rigor than his initial conclusions had suggested, was a narrative far more complex and morally ambiguous than the straightforward crime of passion he had been prepared to prosecute. Edward Ashford had come to Thornfield with the knowledge that his illegitimate son, the product of an indiscretion some 30 years previous, worked as the estate manager. Mr. Thorne had lived his entire life in ignorance of his paternity, until Ashford's arrival at the manor had been preceded by a letter that revealed this uncomfortable truth. The letter, which Inspector Hartwell now retrieved from the Blue Room, explained Hat Ashford intended to acknowledge his son publicly, to amend his will in favor of this previously unknown heir, and to demand that Thorne accept his rightful place in the family. For Thomas Hartley, who had harbored his own secret connection to the Ashford family through his own indiscretion with Susan some months prior, an indiscretion that had resulted in considerable distress and social consequence, the arrival of Ashford had represented a threat of further complication and embarrassment. Miss Catherine Wells had possessed her own complex relationship with Lord Brackenstall, one that suggested neither simple romance nor simple opportunism, but rather a matter of genuine affection, complicated by circumstances of social class and family obligation. And at the center of this web of conflicting emotions and desperate motivations stood Mr. Desmond Thorne, faced with the sudden and unexpected revelation of his own parentage and the opportunity, or perhaps the temptation, to prevent that revelation from becoming public knowledge through whatever means might be necessary. Inspector Hartwell's expression, as the full complexity of the situation began to manifest itself, underwent a transformation that suggested a man confronted with evidence that his initial theory, while containing certain elements of truth, had missed the essential emotional architecture upon which the crime had actually been constructed. He dismissed Lord Brackenstall from custody with a terseness that barely concealed his professional embarrassment, and redirected his full investigative resources toward the considerably more intricate matter of determining precisely what had transpired in the Blue Room and the emotional circumstances that had led to Edward Ashford's death. The confrontation that followed, conducted in the privacy of Lady Thornfield's library, with Miss Marple present at the inspector's request, revealed layers of human motivation so intricately interwoven that they seemed almost to defy singular explanation. Mr. Desmond Thorne, confronted with the evidence of the concealed door between the Blue Room and the adjoining chamber, initially maintained a posture of complete denial. However, when Inspector Hartwell presented the letter that Ashford had written to him, a document of such extraordinary emotional force that even hardened police officers seemed moved by its contents, something within Thorne's carefully constructed defenses appeared to fracture. The letter, written in Ashford's hand with considerable apparent emotion, detailed his own youthful transgression, his years of regret and guilt, his observation of Thorn's life from a distance, and his conviction that his son deserved to know the truth of his origins. It was not, as Inspector Hartwell had initially believed, a document designed to manipulate or to impose unwanted recognition upon an unwilling recipient, but rather a deeply felt attempt at reconciliation and acknowledgement of a debt that Ashford believed himself to owe to both his son and to the woman whose life had been forever altered by his actions. "I loved your mother," Ashford had written, with a passion that was real and genuine, even though circumstance and my own cowardice prevented me from honoring that love as I ought to have done. "You are the best part of both of us, and I have spent every year of your life knowing that I had no right to claim you, yet unable to suppress the knowledge that you existed, that you were in the world, that perhaps I might find some way to make amends." It was this letter Miss Marple understood with the clarity that came from her lifetime of observing human nature, that had precipitated the crisis. Thorn had received it the morning of the garden party, and the shock of sudden revelation, combined with the fury of discovering that his carefully constructed life was about to be irrevocably altered by circumstances entirely beyond his control, had sent him into a state of emotional turmoil from which he had found no adequate outlet. When Ashford had retired to the Blue Room, ostensibly for rest, but actually with the intention of writing a second letter to Thorn, one that was intended to be conciliatory and explanatory in greater depth, Thorn had followed him. The confrontation that had ensued was not, as Inspector Hartwell had imagined, a calculated murder, but rather an explosive argument that had escalated from verbal conflict into physical violence with a rapidity and inevitability that neither participant could have anticipated. Ashford had fallen, striking his head against the marble corner of the fireplace mantel, and in the moments of confusion that followed, Thorn had realized with dreadful clarity that his father was dead, that he had killed him, and that his life as he had known it was irrevocably concluded. The locked room, the concealed passage, the open window, all of these had been conceived in those terrible moments of panic and desperation, an attempt to create an appearance of accident or suicide that might deflect investigation from the truth. It was Thomas Hartley, in a moment of genuine moral courage that Miss Marple observed with considerable respect, who finally provided the testimony that confirmed the outline of these events. The young man's connection to Thorn ran deeper than his mere acquaintance with the estate manager. Years previously, when Thomas had been in considerable personal difficulty, struggling with the consequences of his own youthful indiscretion with Susan and facing the prospect of social and familial ruin, it had been Desmond Thorn who had assisted him, who had provided not merely financial support, but also emotional succor during a period of genuine crisis. Hartley's presence at the manor, his nervousness, his apparent familiarity with matters he claimed not to understand, all of these had stemmed from his awareness that Thorn was in some sort of significant emotional distress. When Hartley had glimpsed Thorn entering the concealed passage leading to the Blue Room, his suspicions had been aroused, and he had followed at a distance. He had heard fragments of the argument that preceded the tragedy, had witnessed the fall, and had then watched as Thorn, in his panic and desperation, had attempted to construct the deception that would hopefully misdirect the investigation. Hartley had remained silent initially, struggling with the moral conflict between loyalty to the man who had once offered him genuine friendship and his obligation to truth and justice. It was only when he realized that Lord Brackenstall was about to be falsely accused of a crime he had not committed that his conscience had finally overcome his reluctance, and he had sought out Miss Marple to confess what he knew. By evening, Mr. Desmond Thorn had been formally charged with manslaughter rather than murder, a charge that reflected the essentially accidental nature of the death, while holding him accountable for the deception that had followed. As the sun set over Thornfield Manor, casting long shadows across the gardens where the autumn flowers had begun to fade, Miss Marple returned to her room and settled once more into her window seat. She reflected, as she always did following the revelation of human weakness and tragedy, upon the extraordinary complexity of motivation that underlay even the simplest acts, and upon the manner in which circumstances beyond one's control could transform an ordinary person into someone capable of acts they would never have imagined themselves committing. The morning following the arrest of Mr. Desmond Thorne brought with it a peculiar quality of relief, mingled with a profound sense of collective unease that seemed to permeate every corner of Thornfield Manor. The guests who had remained overnight began making their various departures, their expressions suggesting a complex mixture of emotions that defied simple categorization. Some appeared genuinely troubled by the revelation of Thorne's culpability, having believed him to be a man of steady character and reliable disposition. Others seemed almost relieved to depart a house that had become associated with tragedy and the uncomfortable proximity to human weakness. Lord Brackenstall had been the first to leave, his automobile departing at first light with the sort of purposeful haste that suggested a man eager to distance himself from circumstances that had threatened his social standing and reputation. Before his departure, however, he had sought out Miss Marple in the morning room to offer his gratitude for her intervention on his behalf. The conversation between them had been brief but curiously intense, with Lord Brackenstall expressing a degree of genuine contrition regarding his earlier conduct, and his willingness to acknowledge that his presence at Thornfield had indeed been far less innocent than he had initially claimed. The matter of his connection to Edward Ashford, it emerged, concerned a business dispute of some complexity, one that Ashford had been attempting to resolve through legal means rather than through any sort of personal confrontation. His silence regarding this history had stemmed not from guilt, but from a desire to avoid further complications to an already delicate situation. Miss Catherine Wells remained at the manor, though her demeanour had undergone a transformation so complete that she seemed almost to be a different person than the composed art instructor who had arrived at the garden party merely 2 days previously. She had asked for, and been granted permission by Lady Thornfield, to occupy a small cottage on the manor grounds for an indefinite period, ostensibly to recover from the shock of recent events, but more realistically, Miss Marple understood, to create distance between herself and the emotional entanglements that had so thoroughly complicated her life. The revelation of her genuine affection for Mr. Thorne, combined with her concurrent emotional involvement with Lord Brackenstall, an involvement that had itself been a matter of circumstance and social pressure rather than authentic inclination, had left her in a state of profound confusion regarding her own heart and its true desires. Thomas Hartley had also remained, though his presence at the manor had shifted from that of a guest to something more nearly resembling that of an unofficial assistant to Inspector Hartwell. The young man's moral courage in finally revealing what he had witnessed had earned him considerable respect from the inspector, and he had been permitted to remain to provide additional testimony as the formal investigation proceeded toward its legal conclusion. There was something in his demeanour, however, that suggested he was grappling with his own complex emotions regarding his actions, caught between the recognition that he had done the right thing and the terrible knowledge that his testimony would result in the imprisonment of a man who had once offered him genuine friendship during a moment of desperate need. It was in the afternoon of that same day that Miss Marple received a visitor in her room that she had not anticipated. Inspector Hartwell himself appeared at her door, his expression suggesting a man who had arrived at certain conclusions that he found somewhat unsettling. He accepted her invitation to sit, and for several moments the two of them remained in silence, a silence that seemed to contain within it a mutual recognition of something that neither quite knew how to articulate. "I wonder, Miss Marple," the inspector finally began, "whether you might assist me in understanding something that has troubled me since our conversations yesterday. You seem to possess a degree of certainty regarding Mr. Thorne's culpability that preceded any substantive evidence. I found myself wondering how you arrived at such conviction." Miss Marple set down her knitting with characteristic deliberation and regarded the inspector with an expression of gentle thoughtfulness. "It was not, Inspector, a matter of certainty so much as a process of elimination combined with certain observations regarding human behavior that have been reinforced through considerable personal experience. You see, the locked room, properly considered, presented less of a mystery than it initially appeared. The question that truly demanded answers concerned the emotional architecture of the situation. Who, among those present, possessed sufficient motive and opportunity to commit this particular crime, and more importantly, Who among them possessed the knowledge of house and circumstance that would suggest access to the concealed passage? She paused, allowing her eyes to rest upon the garden visible through her window, where the autumn leaves were beginning their descent in earnest. But beyond these practical considerations, there was the matter of emotional disturbance. A person who has just murdered another individual, Inspector, even under circumstances of accident or desperation, manifests this knowledge through behavioral indicators that are remarkably consistent. I observed in Mr. Thorne a degree of internal disturbance that exceeded what one might expect from mere nervousness or social anxiety. When combined with his position at the manor and his apparent connection to Mr. Ashford, the pattern began to suggest itself with considerable clarity. Inspector Hartwell nodded slowly, as though absorbing this explanation and finding it, upon reflection, to contain a logic that he himself might have arrived at had he been willing to follow his instincts rather than pursuing the more obvious surface narratives that had initially suggested themselves. "You possess a remarkable gift, Miss Marple," he said finally, "for understanding the human heart. I wonder if you might consider assisting Scotland Yard officially. We could certainly benefit from someone possessed of your particular talents." Miss Marple smiled gently, but shook her head with firmness that admitted of no further argument. "I am too old for such formal arrangements, Inspector, and besides, my usefulness derives precisely from my position as an ordinary village woman, someone whose observations are not expected and therefore not guarded against. Should I become officially associated with police investigations, that invaluable position would be lost forever. I prefer to remain as I am, simply an elderly woman with a fondness for knitting and perhaps an excessive interest in the affairs of those around me." The departure of Inspector Hartwell from Thornfield Manor marked the beginning of what might be termed the village's slow return to its ordinary rhythms, though the events of the preceding days had left indelible marks upon the social fabric of Ashford St. Mary that would require considerably more than the passage of a few weeks to heal. By the following week, the initial sensation that the murder had created had begun to settle into something more nearly resembling historical fact, a notable incident in the village's recent past rather than an immediate and terrifying present. The inquest, conducted with the formal procedures that such matters demanded, had resulted in a verdict of manslaughter in the case of Mr. Desmond Thorne, a finding that reflected the circumstances of the death even as it acknowledged the subsequent deception. Thorne himself had been remanded to await trial, and the village had collectively begun the process of reconciling the image of the quiet, efficient estate manager with the reality of a man capable of killing, however accidentally or despairingly. Miss Marple, who had observed this process of social and psychological recalibration with her customary attention to detail, found herself increasingly aware of the subtle ways in which the community was reconstructing its understanding of the people within it. The vicar, freed from the shadow of suspicion that had briefly fallen upon him and his family, had returned to his ministerial duties with an appearance of renewed purpose, though Miss Marple detected in his sermons a somewhat greater emphasis upon the frailty of human judgment and the dangers of hasty conclusion. Mrs. Ashford had departed for London to attend to the somewhat complex matter of Edward Ashford's estate and the revelation of his previously unknown son, a situation that would, Miss Marple suspected, occupy her attention and that of the family solicitors for considerably some time to come. Thomas Hartley had returned to his position at the bank, though his demeanor had undergone a subtle transformation that suggested a young man matured considerably by his experiences of the preceding days. He had sought out Miss Marple before his departure from the manor to thank her for her discretion and her wisdom in not immediately exposing the knowledge he had possessed. She had assured him that his moral struggle and ultimate choice to do what was right reflected a quality of character that would serve him well in future years. It was on a crisp afternoon in early October, some 2 weeks following the arrest of Mr. Thorne, that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor at her cottage in the village. Miss Catherine Wells, who had been residing in the small cottage on the manor grounds, presented herself at Miss Marple's door with an expression suggesting she had spent considerable time preparing for this conversation. The two women settled themselves in Miss Marple's small parlour, and after the customary exchange of courtesies regarding tea and the weather, Miss Catherine Wells began to speak with a directness that suggested she had overcome whatever initial hesitation had prompted her visit. "I have been thinking a great deal," she began, her voice steady though her hands betrayed some anxiety through their slight trembling, about the manner in which you perceived the true nature of what had occurred, and more particularly about what you must have observed regarding my own situation and my own feelings. I wonder if you might understand why I acted as I did, and whether you might offer me some guidance regarding the path forward that my life must now take." Miss Marple regarded the younger woman with an expression of genuine sympathy combined with the clarity that came from her years of observation. "I suspect, my dear, that your situation is considerably more complex than it might appear to an outside observer. You have been caught between the genuine affection you hold for one man and the social and circumstantial pressures that have drawn you toward another. This is a predicament as old as human nature itself, and one that admits of no easy resolution." She paused, selecting her words with careful deliberation. "However, I would offer you this observation, drawn from considerable personal experience with matters of the heart. The truest basis for a meaningful partnership between two people is not passion, which is fleeting and often deceptive, but rather genuine respect and a shared commitment to each other's well-being. I suspect that your feelings for Mr. Thorne, while authentic, were complicated by gratitude and the natural human tendency to care for those who have suffered. Your involvement with Lord Brackenstall, by contrast, appeared to stem from social pressure and a certain romantic notion that has little foundation in genuine inclination." Miss Catherine Wells had begun to weep quietly, and Miss Marple rose to place a comforting hand upon her shoulder. "What I am attempting to suggest, my dear, is that your present situation, while painful, may ultimately prove to be a liberation. You are no longer bound by the expectations of others, nor are you constrained by the affections of a man whose circumstances have rendered any future relationship impossible. You possess the opportunity to discover what your own heart truly desires, apart from the complicated emotional entanglements that have thus far guided your choices." The conversation that followed extended into the early evening, covering not merely the specific circumstances of Miss Catherine Wells's emotional confusion, but also the broader questions of how one constructs a life of genuine meaning and authenticity in a world that constantly pressures one toward conformity and compromise. By the time Miss Catherine Wells departed, she appeared considerably more at peace with herself, though the resolution of her internal conflicts would, Miss Marple understood, require considerably more time and reflection than a single conversation could provide. As darkness fell over the village, and Miss Marple returned to her knitting by the fireside, she reflected upon the manner in which even the resolution of a crime could not truly resolve the deeper human complications that had given rise to it. The death of Edward Ashford would be remembered as a tragedy, but it would be remembered primarily for the way it had disrupted the ordered surface of village life. The more profound tragedies, the lost opportunities, the complicated loves, the moral struggles that had characterized the internal lives of each person involved, would recede gradually into private memory, acknowledged only by those who had lived through them and by an elderly woman whose gift lay in perceiving such things with clarity and compassion. The trial of Mr. Desmond Thorne, which took place in the county courthouse some 6 weeks following the initial arrest, proceeded with the inexorable formality that such legal proceedings demanded, and it was attended by a considerable portion of the village population, all of whom seemed to regard the event as simultaneously a matter of great importance and a form of entertainment that broke the monotony of the ordinary autumn season. Miss Marple, who had been requested to appear as a witness, travelled to the courthouse on the appointed day dressed in her customary lavender, her demeanour suggesting a woman attending a vicar's tea party rather than a murder trial. The courtroom itself was a handsome Victorian structure of considerable dignity, with high ceilings and wood panelling that seemed designed to impress upon those within it the gravity of the proceedings about to unfold. The barrister for the Crown, a precise and meticulous man named Harrington, conducted his examination of the evidence and witnesses with a clarity that left little room for misunderstanding regarding the basic facts of the case. Edward Ashford had been struck down in a moment of passion and desperation by Mr. Desmond Thorne, his previously unknown son, and the subsequent deception, the locking of the room from within, the open window designed to suggest accident or suicide, represented a clear attempt to obstruct justice and mislead the authorities. The defense, represented by a considerably more flamboyant barrister named Winters, focused his efforts not upon denying the essential facts but rather upon constructing a narrative of sympathetic circumstance that might incline a jury toward leniency. He emphasized Thorne's complete ignorance of his paternity prior to the arrival of Edward Ashford at the manor, the shock of sudden revelation, the emotional turmoil that such knowledge must inevitably produce, and the entirely accidental nature of the death itself. He called character witnesses who testified to Thorne's steady nature, his reliability, and his general absence of violent tendencies. He presented evidence regarding Ashford's health, suggesting that the man had been in a fragile state and that even a relatively minor blow might have had fatal consequences. When Miss Marple was finally called to provide her testimony, the courtroom seemed to settle into a peculiar quality of attentiveness, as though everyone present recognized that her observations might provide some crucial insight into the psychological dimensions of the case that the ordinary evidence could not illuminate. The Crown's barrister questioned her regarding her observations concerning Mr. Thorne's emotional state on the day of the murder, and Miss Marple responded with her customary precision and clarity, describing the particular quality of internal disturbance that she had perceived in the estate manager's demeanor. The defense barrister, however, pursued a different line of questioning, one designed to establish that the emotional turmoil Miss Marple had observed might reasonably be attributed to the shock of learning about one's paternity rather than to the knowledge of having committed a crime. When asked whether it was possible that a man who had just discovered himself to be the illegitimate son of a deceased man might display emotional disturbance without necessarily having knowledge of that death, Miss Marple paused with apparent thoughtfulness before responding. "It is certainly possible," she acknowledged, "though in my experience, the particular quality of disturbance I observed in Mr. Thorne's case possessed a character that suggested knowledge of a specific transgression rather than merely general emotional upheaval. However, I acknowledge that human nature is sufficiently complex that one cannot always be entirely certain in one's interpretations." The trial extended over the course of 3 days, with testimony from Inspector Hartwell, from Thomas Hartley, from various medical experts regarding the nature of the injuries sustained, and from Neume. Rouse other witnesses who had been present at the manor, or who possessed knowledge relevant to the case. By the time the arguments had been concluded, and the jury had withdrawn to consider their verdict, it seemed evident to most observers that the outcome was largely predetermined. Thorne would be convicted, he would serve a term of imprisonment, and the matter would be gradually absorbed into the history of the village and eventually forgotten by all save those most directly affected by it. Yet when the jury returned after deliberating for precisely 4 hours, they delivered a verdict that surprised nearly everyone present. Mr. Desmond Thorne was found guilty not of manslaughter, as had been charged, but of the lesser offence of causing death by dangerous act, a distinction that reflected the jury's acceptance of the defense's argument regarding the essentially accidental nature of the death, combined with their recognition of Thorne's culpability in the subsequent deception and obstruction of justice. The judge, in sentencing, took into account the circumstances of extreme emotional disturbance, the absence of premeditation, and the defendant's previously unblemished record, and imposed a sentence of 8 years' imprisonment with possibility of remission. As Thorne was led away, he turned briefly to meet Miss Marple's gaze, and in that moment there seemed to pass between them an acknowledgment of something that transcended the legal proceedings and the social machinery that had been set in motion. She understood, in that glance, that Thorne comprehended the manner in which she had perceived the truth of what had occurred, while simultaneously exercising a degree of compassion in her revelations, presenting the facts in such a manner as to allow for a degree of mercy that pure justice might not have granted. When the trial concluded, and Miss Marple returned to Ashford, "St. Mary," On the afternoon train, the village seemed curiously unchanged, and yet fundamentally altered by the events of the preceding weeks. The leaves had continued their autumnal descent, the shops remained open for business, the church bells rang at their appointed hours, and the ordinary rhythms of village life continued with their customary steadiness. Yet there was present in the air an awareness that something fundamental had shifted in the collective understanding of the people who inhabited this peaceful corner of England, a recognition that beneath the surface of orderly routine there existed depths of human complexity and moral ambiguity that had previously gone unacknowledged and unexamined. The winter that followed the trial of Mr. Desmond Thorne brought with it the particular quality of stillness that characterizes the English countryside during the colder months, a time when the landscape seemed to turn inward upon itself and the concerns of human society appeared somehow diminished by comparison with the vast indifference of nature. Miss Marple, who had settled back into the comfortable routines of her cottage life, with the ease of someone accustomed to solitude and quiet reflection, found herself frequently engaged in correspondence with the various individuals whose lives had been so thoroughly disrupted by the events at Thornfield Manor. Thomas Hartley had written to her from London, where he had secured a position with a larger banking establishment, expressing his gratitude once more for her discretion and offering observations regarding his own journey toward understanding the moral complexities that had characterized his role in the affair. Lady Thornfield had sent a handwritten note expressing her appreciation for Miss Marple's assistance in resolving the tragedy that had so thoroughly disrupted the peace of her household, and offering an invitat to visit the manor whenever Miss Marple might find it convenient to do so. Most surprisingly, Miss Catherine Wells had written a lengthy letter describing her decision to pursue formal training as an artist, expressing her intention to relocate to London, where she hoped to establish herself within artistic circles, freed from the social constraints and emotional entanglements that had previously limited her opportunities for self-determination. It was in the depths of December, as the winter light had begun its characteristic early descent toward darkness, that Miss Marple received a visitor who had not been anticipated and whose arrival seemed to carry with it a quality of conclusion regarding matters that had remained, in some sense, unresolved. The visitor was none other than the senior governor of the prison establishment to which Mr. Desmond Thorne had been remanded, a gentleman of considerable official standing who had travelled to the village specifically to meet with Miss Marple. He presented himself at her cottage door on an afternoon when frost had begun to crystallize upon the garden plants, bringing with him a letter from Thorne himself, a communication that the prisoner had entrusted to the governor with explicit instructions that it be delivered into Miss Marple's hands personally. The governor, having served in his position for some 3 decades and having developed a considerable respect for the dignity and composure that characterized prisoners of genuine conscience, had deemed the request sufficiently important to warrant a personal visit. The letter, when Miss Marple finally opened it in the privacy of her parlour, contained a message of such profound emotional honesty that it seemed almost to transcend the ordinary limitations of written communication. Thorne had written, with evident care and considerable emotional restraint, of his understanding, regarding the manner in which Miss Marple had perceived the truth of what had occurred, while simultaneously exercising a degree of merciful discretion in her revelations. He acknowledged that her intervention had likely spared him the possibility of a conviction for murder rather than the lesser charge that had ultimately been brought against him, and he expressed a gratitude that seemed to extend beyond mere legal advantage to encompass a recognition of her fundamental compassion and understanding. More significantly, however, Thorne had written of his own journey toward comprehending the events that had led to his father's death. He had come to understand, through months of solitary reflection within the prison establishment, that his initial rage at Edward Ashford, rage stemming from the shock of sudden revelation, and the fury at discovering that his entire understanding of his origins had been founded upon deception, had gradually transformed into something approaching understanding and even a form of grudging respect. Ashford had, after all, come to Thornfield not to impose himself upon an unwilling son, but rather to offer acknowledgment and reconciliation, to attempt to make amends for years of absence and silence. The letter concluded with an expression of resolve that Thorne intended, upon his eventual release, to seek out the woman who had been his mother and to attempt to understand the emotional landscape of her life, a landscape that had been forever altered by her relationship with Edward Ashford. He expressed his hope that this understanding might permit him to construct some form of meaningful existence from the ruins of the life he had previously inhabited. As Miss Marple set down the letter and gazed out toward her frost-covered garden, she felt a curious sense of completion settling over the events of the preceding months. The investigation had concluded. The trial had delivered its verdict, and the various individuals caught up in the tragedy had begun the gradual process of reconstructing their lives around the knowledge of what had occurred. Yet what seemed most significant to her in this moment of quiet reflection was not the forensic resolution of the crime itself, but rather the manner in which each person involved had been forced to confront dimensions of their own character and capacity for both good and ill that might otherwise have remained hidden beneath the surface of ordinary existence. The vicar had learned something regarding the dangers of hasty judgment and the importance of reserving moral condemnation until one possessed complete understanding. Thomas Hartley had discovered within himself a capacity for moral courage that transcended his natural inclination toward self-preservation. Lord Brackenstall had been reminded that social position and aristocratic bearing could not insulate one from suspicion when circumstances appeared to warrant it. Miss Catherine Wells had discovered that liberation from constrained social roles, while painful, could ultimately permit the emergence of authentic selfhood. And Desmond Thorne, imprisoned though he might be, had begun a journey toward understanding and reconciliation that promised, however distantly, some form of redemption. As the winter darkness continued its encroachment upon the afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her knitting with the serene satisfaction of one whose understanding of human nature had once again been confirmed by the events of reality. She understood, as perhaps few others could, that the resolution of a crime was merely the beginning of a far longer and more complex process through which individuals attempted to integrate the knowledge of their own capacity for transgression into a coherent understanding of themselves and their pile. Within the moral order of the world, the window pane beside her chair had grown cold to the touch with the onset of evening, yet Miss Marple found in this physical manifestation of seasonal change a comfort that seemed to reflect the eternal cycles through which human nature perpetually moved, forever transforming, yet remaining fundamentally unchanged in its essential character.